In our last lecture, we started looking at sacred places in world mythology. We looked last time at some rocks and a lake from the Hebrew, Australian, and Tibetan cultures. This time, we'll take a look at what has to be the most important single category of sacred places, and that's mountains. This time, we will be looking at mountains from the Middle East to Native America to Tibet to China to show the importance of mountains in the mythologies of virtually all peoples, especially peoples who live close to mountains. Mountains are the highest places on earth, and thus they share some of the values of heaven. Values like transcendence or being on high or vertical or supreme. Mountains almost automatically become the homes of the gods for people who have mountains in the area. Each mountain becomes, for the people who live near it, an axis mundi, which we talked about last time. And most people also understand that the pole star is located directly over that important mountain to show that that mountain is the dead center of the universe, the navel of the world, the place where the past, the present, and the future, where the divine and the ordinary can intersect, and thus redeem the ordinary, the profane, and make it meaningful and significant. We'll begin our look at mountains this time with what has to be one of the most famous mountains, at least in our tradition, that is Mount Sinai, which is a central symbol for three of the world's great religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Nobody knows precisely which peak is Mount Sinai, but tradition has identified one in the southern Sinai Peninsula, which is called Mount Moses. In the story, as we have it, according to Exodus, Moses had been here once before, or at least near here, when he was tending the flocks of his father-in-law near Mount Horeb. That's the time when one day he noticed the bush burning. The bush continues to burn, but the bush is not consumed, and Moses draws near to find out what's going on, and when he gets close enough, he hears the voice of God speaking to him out of the bush, saying, "Take your shoes off and don't come any closer. This is holy ground." We looked at that story a little bit in the last lecture. This time, when the Israelites came there, they had just recently escaped from Egypt, and they had been wandering in the desert for 3 months, and they were hungry, and they were thirsty, and they were very nervous about whether they had done the right thing in leaving Egypt in the first place. With the people camped below the mountain, Moses climbs up into it to meet God, who had brought his people this far. God tells Moses at that meeting that if the people will keep their covenant with him, he will make them a holy nation, and he promises in 3 days he will personally visit the top of the mountain and meet with Moses again. Meanwhile, during that 3-day period, the people were supposed to purify themselves, and they were not supposed to touch the mountain, which is now a very holy place. On the 3rd day, there was thunder and lightning, and there were trumpet blasts, and a dense cloud covered the whole mountain. The mountain quakes, and then God descends as a fire, and smoke from that fire covers both the mountain and the sky. When God alights on the mountain, he calls Moses and gives him the 10 Commandments. He gave him a lot of other sundry obligations while he was at it too, but the most important were those 2 tablets, which were presumably inscribed with God's own finger. And then Moses carries those tablets down the mountain back down to his people. But when he gets to the bottom of the mountain, he finds the people dancing around a golden calf. The people are not sure about their new faith. They were worried about Moses' absence. He'd been gone for 40 days and 40 nights after all. And while he was gone, they had talked Aaron, Moses' brother, into melting down all the gold they had brought with them to make an idol for them. Moses had just spent 40 days in the presence of God, and he comes upon, at the bottom of the hill, this appalling evidence of human weakness. And in anger, in wrath, he smashes the tablets. He has the golden calf burned, and he grinds it into powder, and he mixes it with water and makes the Israelites drink it. Then, with the help of the tribe of Levi, he slaughters 3,000 Israelites. The people repent, God relents, and he reaffirms the covenant with them, and new tablets are provided, and so that story, at least for the time being, seems to end well. The Decalogue, of course, those 10 Commandments, are one of the most important moments in the history of the world. It's a perfect illustration of what happens when the divine penetrates our ordinary lives. While we're worshiping the golden calf down below on the mountaintop, God is entering into human life and changing it forever by putting us back into contact with the forces that made the cosmos in the first place. The idea of a mountain as an axis mundi, in fact, runs through almost all of the Old Testament. Most of God's most important revelations to his people happen on mountains. God, we remember, remakes his covenant with Noah on Mount Ararat at the end of the flood story in Lecture 9. It's on a mountaintop where Abraham offers to sacrifice his son Isaac because God had demanded it. And it's on that same mountain that God saves Isaac and then renews his covenant with Abraham. The prophet Elijah defeats the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. David establishes Jerusalem next to Mount Zion, that holy hill that gave the Zionist movements its name, and that was the movement that led eventually to the creation of the country of Israel. And the Psalms, if you read the Psalms, they are full of mountain imagery, as in, just for example, Psalm 125, which tells us, "They that trust in the Lord shall be as Mount Zion, which cannot be removed, but which abideth forever. As the mountains are about Jerusalem, so the Lord is about his people, from henceforth even forever." The two religions that owe the most to Judaism, that is Christianity and Islam, took up the imagery of mountains, the idea of a mountain as an axis mundi, and maintained that focus on mountains in both of those traditions. If we can just think for a moment how many important New Testament events occur on mountains. Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, lies on a high ridge south of Jerusalem. When Jesus is tempted by Satan after 40 days in the wilderness, the last occurs on a mountaintop where Satan offers Jesus all the kingdoms of the world. Jesus' most famous sermon is the Sermon on the Mount. The Transfiguration, in which Jesus appears with Moses and Elijah, occurs on a mountaintop, and there God speaks out of a cloud, just as he had done on Mount Sinai. Jesus' crucifixion happens on Mount Calvary, or Golgotha. And as we've mentioned in Christian tradition, Jerusalem considered the center of the world, and Adam is buried there, so that according to this tradition, the blood that was shed on the cross falls directly onto Adam's skull. Jesus appears to his disciples after his resurrection on a mountain in Galilee, and by tradition, he ascends back into heaven from the Mount of Olives. Islam likewise borrowed, or if didn't borrow, at least uses the same kind of idea for mountains that the Old Testament has. Islam, of course, accepts Noah and Moses and Elijah and Jesus as prophets, and mountains, therefore, are featured in their most important events, too. Muhammad receives his call from the angel Gabriel on Mount Hira. The summit of Mount Moriah, the site of Solomon's temple, and by tradition, the place where God commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, is the place from which Muhammad ascended into heaven on his famous night journey, where he met Abraham and Moses and Jesus and other prophets. The final revelation of the Quran came on Mount Mercy, just outside Mecca, where pilgrims to the Kaaba to this day gather to remember that all Muslims are brothers and sisters. And the Kaaba itself, as we've mentioned before, is itself an axis mundi, a center of the world, exactly under the pole star. So that's kind of an indication of what mountains can mean in those three great traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The San Francisco Peaks above Flagstaff, Arizona, are sacred to a number of Native American peoples of the Southwest United States, particularly to the Hopi, in a way that's quite different from the sacredness of mountains for Judaism and Christianity and Islam. These San Francisco Peaks also illustrate Eliad's point that sacred places don't just commemorate something that happened a long time ago. They are not just historical sites, but they give continuous access to that same power now. For the Hopi, the San Francisco Peaks are the home of the Kachinas. These are spirits of nature who are also spirits in some ways of their ancestors. And the primary blessings of the Kachina is that each year they bring the rains that are needed for agriculture. The Hopis have their own myth about how they discovered the Kachinas. For a long time, people had noticed strange creatures moving around the foot of the peaks. To find out what was going on here, they sent a young warrior up into the mountain, and he carried with him a handful of feathered prayer sticks as offerings. Near the top, he came across a kiva, which is one of those underground chambers, like the kinds that are used in Hopi ceremonies, and a voice from inside the kiva called the young warrior and invited him in. There he came upon a man who said that he was an immortal spirit who lived in an underworld that is underneath the mountain. Then came a very frightening looking creature with a black face, a long snout, dangerous looking teeth, who said he was a kachina, and that turns out to be one of the creatures that the Hopi had seen prowling around the foot of the mountain. The warrior gave him some prayer sticks, which pleased the kachina, and after they had their long interview, the kachina said that from now on the kachinas would form rain-bearing clouds over the tops of those mountains when the people prayed to them and offered them prayer sticks. From then on, the San Francisco Peaks have become sacred, a sacred place for these people, as sacred to them as a church or a temple might be in another tradition. The mountain, according to the Hopi, the mountain itself contains an opening that leads down to the heavenly underworld where the ancestors live. They emerge from that opening certain times of the year, and they return at certain times based on the agricultural calendar. When they return, because they are also spirits of the ancestors, they can carry messages from the living to the dead ancestors who live there. According to the story that the young warrior was told, the kachinas started out living among the people, but there came a time when they were no longer shown proper respect, so they withdrew. So they now no longer appear in bodily form. From that time on, the Hopis have to have held ceremonies to honor the kachinas to make sure they're not offended again. And secondly, because the kachinas are not in bodily form, they have to provide the bodies for the kachinas when they appear. At the winter solstice, the kachinas leave their underground home and they move to the mesas, where they enter bodies of masked dancers. This is, they occupy the bodies of living elders and dancers, and that's how they have substance for the time that they're there. When they arrive, they bring the rains. They can be seen, and you know when the kachinas are coming down because they can be seen forming rain clouds on the mountaintop, and then they come marching down to join the annual ceremonies in their honor. They remain in spirit form with the people until July, and then shortly after the summer solstice, they return to the mountains, and when they go, they carry messages with them from the living to their dead ancestors. They're sent on their way with a grand going home dance. Edwin Birnbaum, in his book Sacred Mountains of the World, had talked to one of the masked dancers, one of those people who gets inhabited, who gets entered by one of these kachinas, and he asked him what it felt like. And this is what he said. He says, "When I put on the mask and start to dance, I feel something enter me, and I am no longer myself. I become someone else. A power comes, but often I don't see its effects until much later." At other times of the year, when the kachinas themselves are inside underneath the mountain, the Hopi themselves go on pilgrimages to those mountains. They climb to the evergreen forest near its base, and there they make offerings at kachina shrines. The elders and the priests climb all the way to the top, where they commune with the ancestors and they pray to the kachinas who represent them. Through the kachinas, the Hopi have access to that divine power that structures and maintains the world, and the San Francisco Peaks are the site of that power, the locus of the interaction between worlds. Another very sacred mountain in the world is one called Mount Kailas in Tibet. It's part of the Himalayan range. This one may be the most sacred mountain in the world, given the number of people who consider it sacred. Hindus and Buddhists and Jains and Sikhs and Bons, the last members of that indigenous religion of Tibet before the coming of Buddhism, 500 million people consider this to be a sacred mountain. The 4 major rivers of the Indian subcontinent start here, and the Indians also consider it the source of the Ganges, which flows, according to their story, through Shiva's hair to blunt its force before it emerges from a glacier 140 miles to the west. It's not the highest peak in the Himalayas, Mount Everest is that, but its location, its relative isolation from other peaks so that it can be seen from miles and miles away, all give it a really special place for these peoples. For the Hindus, the mountain is the dwelling place of Shiva and his consort Parvati, We went through this story in Lecture 20. Remember, she was the daughter of the god of the Himalayas, and she was also the reincarnation of Shiva's first wife. As we went through that story back in Lecture 20, we remember that the gods had been told that there was a demon who was going to be born, who was going to be so powerful that he could destroy the world unless he could be stopped, and the only way he could be stopped was if Shiva could be talked into having a son. That son would be able to defeat the dragon, the demon. As we remember the story, the trouble was that Shiva was in deep meditation at the moment. His body covered with ashes, his hair piled in a knot on top of his head, and he had been in deep meditation for a very long time. He was also in mourning for the loss of his first wife, Sati. We know, but he doesn't know it yet, but Parvati is really a reincarnation of Sati. Parvati herself has come to re-win Shiva as her husband, and she has been in meditation and practicing austerities for several thousand years, getting ready to develop enough power to attract his attention. When she does, when he looks up once and sees her, Kami, the Indian god of love, sends one of his flower's arrows right into Shiva's heart. Shiva catches a glimpse of Kami just the moment he lets the arrow fly, and just with a glance, he reduces the god of love to ashes. But the arrow, fortunately, strikes home, hits his heart, and as soon as Shiva sees Parvati, they fall in love. They are married in the castle of her father, who is the lord of the Himalayas, and then they go to live on Mount Kailas, where they have the son who defeats the demons. Later on, they will have a second son, Ganesha, the elephant-headed god, and all of them now live on Mount Kailas, and they are often painted by Indian painters. Living up there somewhere on Mount Kailas is the home of Shiva and Parvati and their son. In the Mahabharata, Arjuna, one of the central characters, goes up into the mythical Mount Meru to learn power from Shiva. And at the poem's end, all 5 brothers and their common wife Draupadi climb up into the same mythical mountain when their earthly lives are finished. Since most Hindus consider Mount Kailas to be the earthly manifestation of that Mount Meru directly beneath the pole star, the center of the world, this makes Mount Kailas really important in the Mahabharata as well. Tibet today is a Buddhist country, and Mount Kailas figures in all kinds of myths that tell about the conversion from Bon to Buddhism. In one, there is a Buddhist yogi named Milarepa who comes to Tibet from India, and he roams across Tibet dressed only in a cotton shirt, and that's pretty austere already. When he comes to pay homage to Mount Kailas and the sacred lake at its foot, he encounters one Neru Bunchan, who's a shaman of the Bon religion, who tells him this is Bon country, and that if he stays, he will have to convert to their religion. Milarepa refuses, and that sets up a kind of contest between these two great religious leaders to see who can defeat whom, to see which tradition can claim Mount Kailas as its spiritual center. In a way, this is a little like the battle between Elijah and the prophets of Baal that we mentioned just a few minutes ago to decide which religion is going to win, whose God is more powerful. The final test of this contest between these two great religious figures is a race to reach the top of Mount Kailas. On the day before the race, Naro Bunchan goes through all kinds of spiritual exercises, getting himself ready, giving himself the power he needs to climb that mountain. On the day of the race, he ascends the mountain on his shaman's drum. In the meantime, Milarepa has slept in that morning. He's not paying any attention at all. His followers get worried. They said, look, your opponent is already ascending the mountain on his shaman's drum. But he simply makes a gesture with his hand, and the Bon priest on his drum finds himself circling just below the peak, unable to rise any higher. After a while, he looks up, and there sits Milarepa above him on the summit. He's forced to admit defeat. the shaman is so startled, according to one version of the story, that he falls off his drum. And when he falls off his drum, the drum bounces down the south slope of Mount Kailas, making what look to be a series of steps, and which are still there, which can still be seen to this day. Hindus, in fact, consider them to be the stairway to Shiva's heaven. Milarepa then establishes Tibet as a Buddhist country, but, and this is a really interesting part of the myth, he allows Naru Bunchan to stay on a nearby peak where he can practice his own religion. It suggests perhaps one of the ways in which Tibetan Buddhism absorbed a lot of the indigenous Bon religion with all of its spirits and demons, so that Tibetan Buddhism is very different from that of Buddhism in any other place. For the Tibetans, for the Tibetan Buddhists, the summit of Mount Kailas is the home of Demchog, a deity with 4 faces, red, blue, green, and white, who wears a tiger skin and a garland of human skulls and who dances with his consort on the top of the mountain. His name means something like one of supreme bliss, and the dance that he dances with his consort is the realization of ultimate reality. The peak is also, according to the Buddhists, the home of 500 Buddhist saints who have achieved nirvana, and some people have claimed to actually be able to hear those 500 priests chanting from the top of the mountain in the clear Tibetan air. For both Buddhists and Hindus, the mountain is the site of the most sacred pilgrimage possible. The idea is to go there, take the 32-mile walk around its circuit. For Buddhists, completing that circuit once atones for the sins of a lifetime. Doing that circuit 108 times achieves nirvana immediately. But for all of the benefits it can confer, this may be one of the least visited sacred mountains in the world. It's extraordinarily difficult to get there. Throughout much of Tibet history, outsiders haven't been very welcome. And each year, quite a large number of pilgrims die either getting there or on the circumambulation itself, the highest point of which is 19,000 feet above sea level. And perhaps for these reasons, the place has always seemed almost tangibly holy to people who have visited it. Birnbaum gives his account of his visit to Mount Kailas, and it's a beautiful description. This is what he says he felt when he visited this. He said, in 1988, I went to the sacred mountain. Late in the afternoon, 3 of us climbed up a ridge for the view of the south face with its stairway leading to heaven. Polished to a smooth finish by wind and sun, the white dome of Kailas gleamed against the sky, amazingly pure in the simplicity of its form. The wind came up, ripping at our faces, and my companions decided to go down. It was autumn and very cold. I stayed alone to watch the mountain turn orange and red in the sunset. As shadows deepened behind the peak, I began to fear that I had lingered too long. But something kept me there to see the last ray of the sun flare gold on the summit. Then, no longer anxious but strangely excited, I started down in the twilight, suspended in the sky over the darkening plain of Barka and the waters of Lake Manasarovar, and the snows of the Himalayas glimmering blue in the distance. That lake, by the way, is a sacred lake as well. Some of the ashes of Mahatma Gandhi were scattered there at his request after his assassination. Birnbaum goes on, I felt as I had 20 years before when I first went to Nepal and stayed alone high on a ridge to watch Mount Everest fade in the sunset, open and free. Whistling a song, I danced down the slopes of the mountain, filled with a wild feeling of laughter and joy. There are so many other sacred mountains in the world that we could talk about. Mount Fuji in Japan, or some of the peaks of the Sierra Madre in Mexico that were sacred to peoples long before the coming of the Spaniards. Some peaks of the Andes in Chile and Peru, and some of the volcanoes of Hawaii. But let me finish with one sacred mountain in China. This is Mount T'ai Shan in the eastern part of the country. It's not the highest point in China, and it is far more humanized, to use Birnbaum's term, than, say, the pristine mountains of the Himalayas. This mountain is, in fact, dotted with 1,000 years of religious devotion. There are 7,000 steps that lead upward from the T'ai Shan, the city of peace at the bottom, to the temple of the Jade Emperor at the very top. In between, the slopes are covered with shrines and temples and inns and booths selling food and religious supplies. And every ridge, every tree, every boulder has its own name by this time. It has been visited so often. There's one great slab of rock covering an entire hillside that has been inscribed with the Diamond Sutra, which is a Buddhist text that reminds travelers of the passing nature of reality, which is symbolized as you climb by the vast expanse of blue sky overhead. Chinese emperors have offered sacrifices at the bottom of the mountain and then climbed to the top and offered sacrifices there and have built temples all the way along the stairway to the summit. The mountain became so important that the Chinese came to believe that souls who died would assemble just below the highest peak, where T'ai Shan himself would pass judgment. Eventually, that deity of the mountain came to be thought to preside over everything that happens in life from the time one is born till the time one dies. Birnbaum says that until the communist revolution of 1949, every village of any importance had a temple dedicated to the ruler of this sacred mountain, and one of the largest temples in Beijing was dedicated to him. For 4,000 years, pilgrims of all stations and classes have come to pay homage. Before the communist revolution, at the height of the pilgrimage season, which happened about March and April, about 10,000 people each day would climb those 7,000 steps to receive blessings. Birnbaum says that today it's primarily a tourist site, but all of the temples and shrines built along the way still gives it a resonance beyond that of simple tourism. The pilgrimage route passes through 3 heavenly gates, each one marking an entrance to a more sacred zone. The first gate at the bottom, where the pilgrim leaves the mundane world behind, begins the ascent. Halfway up, there's a second gate, after which the climb becomes much more difficult. The path then plunges into what's called the mouth of the dragon and then twists up to the summit. The last part of the climb is 1,000 steps, which ends at the south gate of heaven, which is a red arch with a golden roof. Birnbaum says that once you're here, the view is so awesome that one can understand how it can reduce the entire human world below to illusion, to nothing, the way the Buddhists understand it. Just below the summit, there is a temple of the Princess of Azure Clouds. She's the daughter of T'ai Shan, and she's the goddess of dawn. In the past, mothers of daughters who couldn't conceive have climbed here to pray for grandchildren. Dawn's 2 attendants can cure blindness and other childhood diseases, so others came to offer sacrifices and to pray to them there. On the summit is the Temple of the Jade Emperor, the heavenly ruler of the world, where emperors and peasants have been coming for 4,000 years to make contact with the power that once created the universe and is still accessible to those who find their way to this axis mundi. Let me end all of this with a Chinese fairy tale to illustrate the power of mountains. This one is set not in T'ai Shan, but in the Yangshu Mountains in southeast China. The story concerns a young man, poor young man, named Kailas, who lives with his mother. One day, a hungry, poor, frail old man comes to their door, and they take pity on him, they feed him, they take him in, they allow him to warm himself. And then, when he is eaten, he seems so frail, so feeble, that the young man offers to carry him home. He says he lives in the mountains, and the young man carries him to the mountains, and there the old man directs him into a chamber which turns out to be filled with fantastic treasure. He says that the young boy and his mother have been so kind to him. He said, I want you to just take anything you want, any of the treasures in here, take whatever you want and take it with you. Of all things, Kailas chooses a stone grinder, which he says will help him and his mother make a living. It turns out to be a magic grinder. It produces corn whenever the lid is turned. And so things go pretty well for Kailas and his mother, but soon the neighbors find out about it, and then other people find out about this magic grinder they have, and soon a corrupt king finds out about it, comes and confiscates it. The trouble is that when the king tries to use it, it only turns out lime. Lime is, instead of producing corn, it produces lime. The young man then goes back to the old man's chambers in this chamber, and this time he chooses a stone mortar. Again, it's magic, turning out that whenever it's pounded with a pestle, it produces rice. Again, the king eventually finds out about it. Again, the king confiscates it. And again, when the king tries it, it turns out only ordinary yellow clay, not rice at all. So the young man goes back one more time. This time he takes a hoe, which produces corn the moment it's put into the ground. This time, the king decides to skip the middleman. He captures the young man and says, take me to where you're getting this stuff. And so the young man is forced to lead the king off to this mountain chamber. The young man had been getting into the chamber with a gold key that the old man's daughter had given him. The door closes behind him as soon as he's in, and he needs a silver key to get back out. Otherwise, he's trapped inside the mountain forever. When Koli takes the king and his retinue to the chamber, he gives him the gold key, and they all go in, and he keeps the silver key in his own hand, and that's the end of the king because he's trapped inside the mountain chamber now. The keys were made from a daughter's earrings, the old man's daughter's earrings, and Koli and his mother go back to apologize for having lost the gold one. But the old man and his daughter say, never mind. The old man gives the daughter to the young man in marriage, and then he and the chamber disappear forever. There are lots of Chinese values in this story: self-sacrifice, hard work, honoring one's ancestors and elders, not being greedy. But there's also the idea that there's a power in the mountain that can cut across ordinary cause-effect patterns in our lives, bringing a divine energy to bear in the midst of our normal, natural life. This is a kind of fairy tale version of an axis mundi. Next time, we will take a look at sacred trees in the myths of the world, what they are, what they symbolize, how they're used in myths, and how one particular tree came to be sacred. That's next time.